I am on. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-ali al-azim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma akhrajni min dhulumat al-wahm wa akramni bi nur al-fahm. Allahumma aftah alayna abwaab rahmatik wa anshur alayna khaza'in ulumik bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Alhamdulillah, we studied all the subjects in the book Masail Fiqhiyya by late Allama Sharafuddin, except one topic, one subject. All of them we studied. Something that I thought is also good to discuss is the issue of adhan, that I want to share with you a book by Ayatullah Subhani. May Allah inshallah give him long life. Can you see the, yeah? Okay. So you can find this also online, imamsadiq.org, in Arabic and Farsi. He has, mashallah, many books. He has a series of books which are about fiqh issues which are different between Shia and some schools of Islam. Sometimes some schools agree, some schools don't agree. Called Silsilatul Masail al-Fiqhiyya. Some of these are the things we already studied. For example, Al-Qasru fi Safar, about making your salat short when you travel. About Al-Basmala, whether Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is part of every surah or not. We talked about this. Some of them we didn't study. For example, Al-Ishhadu ala talaq wa talaq thalathan. One thing which is different between different schools is when you divorce, is there need for witnesses to be there, or a husband can just in private divorces his wife? We say there must be witnesses. Or at-talaqu thalathan, can you divorce 3 times in one majlis? We say no, but some schools say yes. You know the story of Allama Hildi and Oljaito. So these are different issues. What I want to discuss tonight is al-adhan tashri'an wa fusulan ala dhaw al-kitab wa sunnah. This is about adhan, how adhan started in the first place. Legislation of adhan, call for prayer, and also then he has a discussion about parts of adhan which we would not be able to do it today. For example, is there as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm in part of adhan, or it's not part of adhan? So we go to the discussion about adhan from the book Al-Adhanu Tashri'an wa Fusulan ala Dhaw al-Kitab wa Sunnah. According to Shia, we believe that adhan is very important kind of manifesto for Islam. It's a very important way of Muslims relating to each other and introducing Islam to others. It's not just call for prayer. It somehow summarizes our worldview. So it's very important. And we believe that this is something that is decided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet was taught Even the Prophet didn't, invent adhan. Let alone others inventing or having dream of adhan and then saying to the Prophet. But some other schools of Islam, they have different versions, but one version is that the Prophet was wondering what would be the best way to call people for prayer. They needed to make some announcement. And there were different suggestions. Some people said, we should use bells like Christians. Some people said we should use horns like Jews. So there were different suggestions. And then they say that Abdullah ibn Zayd said, I had a dream, or between being awake and dreaming, sleeping, I was inspired that we can use human voice. And Rasulullah said, yes, it's a good idea, and we can take it. So this is how Azan started, according to some schools of Islam. So Ayatullah Subhani brings first the hadith from Shia sources, then supporting hadith from Sunni sources, and then conflicting hadith. Okay? So from Shia sources, we go forward. Al-Kulayni, Sheikh Kulayni in Al-Kafi, bisanadin sahih, through an authentic chain of narration, quotes from Zurara and Fudail, both of them from Imam Baqir alayhi salam. Hadith is sahih, and also that Kafi, that Rasulullah went for Mi'raj, he had ascension. Lamma usriya bi Rasulillah ila sama, when Allah took him to heaven. فَبَلَغَ الْبَيْتَ الْمَعْمُورِ, Rasulullah reached Baytul Ma'mur. Baytul Ma'mur is parallel to Kaaba. Angels do tawaf around Baytul Ma'mur, and human beings somehow follow them by doing tawaf around Kaaba. And Baytul Ma'mur is under Arsh. So anyway, when Rasulullah reached Baytul Ma'mur, وَحَضَرَتِ الصَّلَاةِ, and then it was the time of Salat, فَأَذَّنَ جَبْرَائِيل alayhi السلام وَأَقَامَ. Jibreel made adhan and iqama. فَتَقَدَّمَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم بَصَّفَّ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالنَّبِيُّونَ خَلْفَ Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So Azan and Iqamah were made by Jibreel, and Rasulullah became Imam, and then other prophets and angels, they said prayer behind the Prophet. So according to this hadith, at least, maybe this was not the first time, but at least this is one incident that Jibreel made Adhan, and Rasulullah was also witness. There is also another authentic hadith, but this time from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. That was from Imam Baqir alayhi salam. لما هبط جبرائيل بالأذان على رسول الله. This is another incident. When Jibreel brought down adhan to the Prophet, Rasulullah was maybe having nap or sleeping or having rest, because he says كان رأسه في حجر علي. So he was putting his head on the lap of Imam Ali alayhi salam. فأذن جبرائيل وأقام. Jibreel made adhan and iqama. فلما انتبه رسول الله, when Rasulullah noticed, قال يا علي سمعت, oh Ali, have you heard? Imam Ali said yes. Then he said ادعو بلالا, call Balal. فدعا علي بلالا فعلمه. Then Amir al-Mu'minin taught Balal how to say adhan and iqama. Hadith number 3 again is Sahih, that he quotes, and Umar ibn Udayna and Sadiq alayhi salam. Imam alayhi salam said to Umar ibn Udayna, ما تروي هذه, means هذا الجماعة, what do they narrate, these people, what do they say? He said, I said, جعلت فداك في ماذا, may I be your ransom, about what? He said, في أذانهم. What do they say about adhan? He said, I told them, إنهم يقولون إن أبي بن كعب رآه في النوم. They say Ubay ibn Ka'b, because Ayatullah Subhani later mentions that those reports that they say it was dream, they are conflicting. Who had this dream? How many people had this dream? You know, they are not all the same. So he said, here it says that they say Ubay ibn Ka'b in dream saw adhan. Imam said, no. فَإِنَّ دِينَ اللَّهِ أَعَزُّ مِنْ أَنْ يُرَى فِي النَّوْمِ. Religion of Allah is greater than being seen in dream. Then Sudairas Sayrafi, who was there, he says to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, please you explain to us, talk about this to us. Imam said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ لَمَّا عَرَجَ بِالنَّبِيِّهِ إِلَى سَمَاوَاتِهِ السَّبْعِ. Then becomes similar to the first hadith. That in Mi'raj, over there, Jibreel said azan and iqama. Shahid Awwal, in his, because Shahid Awwal was Lum'e, but also he has a book called Al-Dhikra. He quotes from Ibn Abi Aqil, who was a jurist of the 4th century, from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, that Imam Sadiq was very unhappy with the people who said Rasulullah took adhan from Abdullah ibn Zayd. And he said, ينزل الوحي على نبيكم فتزعمون أنه أخذ الأذان من عبد الله ibn Zayd. Revelation comes to your prophet and then you think he learned azan from Abdullah ibn Zayd. So these are 4 samples of the hadith that Shia have, which indicate that adhan has its roots with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Rasulullah was taught by Jibreel about adhan, and he then introduced it to people. Non-Shia also have similar hadiths. It's not that all their hadiths say, that it's from people. So now we mention some Sunni hadiths that are supporting the same idea. For example, Hakim Naysaburi narrates from Sufyan ibn al-Layl that when the issue between Muawiyah and Imam Hassan alayhi salam happened, the issue of was fight and then was peace, treaty. He says, لما كان من أمر الحسن بن علي ومعاوية ما كان. At that time, he said, I went to Medina. to see Imam Hassan. And we talked about adhan when Imam Hassan was there. فَقَالَ بَعْضُنَا, some of us told Imam Hassan, كَانَ بَدْءُ الْأَذَانِ رُؤْيَا Abdullah ibn Zayd. Some people said to Imam Hassan that the beginning of adhan was the dream of Abdullah ibn Zayd. But قال الحسن بن علي إن شأن الأذان أعظم من ذلك. Azan's position is greater than this. أذن جبرائيل في السماء مثنى مثنى وعلمه رسول الله وأقام مرة مرة فعلمه رسول الله. Jibreel did azan and iqama. Azan 2 in pairs of 2 2 and iqama 1 1. Because you know in iqama some of the things which are in azan 2 are 1. And taught Rasulullah. And then Rasulullah taught other people. So this is by Hakim Nayshaburi in Al-Mustadrak ala Sahihain. It's not from a Shia source. In Kanzul Ummal, again a very important Sunni source by Muttaqi Hindi, he quotes from Zayd ibn Ali, the person who Zaydi Shia follow him for Imami, Zayd ibn Ali ibn al-Hussein. Okay, so he quotes from him from his fathers, means Imam Zainul Abidin, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, from Amir al-Mu'mineen, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam ulima al-adhan laylatan usriya bih wa furidat alayhi salat. In the same night of Mi'raj, Rasulullah was taught adhan, and when salat became wajib. So this is reported by Al-Muttaqi Al-Hindi in Kanzul Ummal. Halabi quotes from Abil Ala that I said to Muhammad ibn Hanafiyyah that we believe, we talk that أن بدء هذا الأذان كان من رؤيا رآها رجل من الأنصار في منامه. He said, I told Muhammad ibn Hanafiyyah that the beginning of adhan was a dream of one of the people of Ansar. Doesn't mention Abdullah ibn Zayd. ففزع لذلك محمد بن الحنفية فزعا شديدا. Muhammad ibn Hanafiyyah was very sad and, like cried or lamented. قال عمدتم إلى ما هو الأصل في شرائع الإسلام ومعالم دينكم فزعمتم أنه إنما كان من رؤيا رآها رجل من الأنصار في منامه. You have put your hand on something which is one of the principles of religion, salat, and then as its requirement, adhan. These are very important. And then you say this was because of a dream that someone had, and dream can be false, can be true. تحتمل الصدق والكذب. How can you make dream hujjah, dream of a person? Even they don't say dream of the Prophet, they say they were dream of a Muslim. He says, I told Muhammad ibn Hanafiyyah, هذا الحديث قد استفاض في الناس. But I said, this is very spread among people. قال هذا والله الباطل. Said, by Allah, this is false. And then he quotes some other hadith from Sunni sources that they say the same thing. But the conflicting hadith, which we find in some other non-Shia sources, they say things that are not acceptable. They say, as I said, there was a discussion about what to do for calling people for salat. Some people say we should put a flag, some people said we should use bell, some people said we should use a horn, etc. And then they say Kana Nabi ala hadil hala. Rasulullah was somehow not yet making up his mind. He was thinking, what should we do? Then Abdullah ibn Zayd came and said, in a condition between sleeping and being awake, I saw someone is calling for prayer. It's a human, call for prayer. And in some versions they say, then the second Khalifa said, I also had this dream 20 days ago, but I didn't say anything. And when Abdullah ibn Zayd said, then he said. And they say, Rasulullah said, so why you didn't tell me that you had this dream? And he said, because he said first and I felt shy to mention. And then they say, Rasulullah said, Ya Bilal, qum, fanzur ma ya'muruka bihi Abdullah ibn Zayd. Bilal, listen what Abdullah ibn Zayd is telling you, do this as a call for prayer. فَعَلَّمَهُ فَتَعَلَّمَ بِلَالَ الْأَذَانِ وَأَذَّنَ. This is the summary of what they have. For example, then Ayatullah Subhani starts mentioning some of these. For example, and it is interesting that in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari, there seems to be no such things. But in some other Sahih they have. For example, in Sunan Abu Dawud, it says, اهتم النبي للصلاة. He was concerned. كيف يجمع الناس لها. How can he bring people together for salat? فقيل له, this is in Sunan Abu Dawud, انسب راية عند حضور الصلاة. Put a flag. When time of salat is, put a flag in the air. فإذا رأوها أذن بعضهم بعضا, or آذن بعض. When someone sees the flag, then they inform each other and say, look, the flag is now hanging, we can go to salat. فَلَمْ يُعْجِبْهُ ذَلِكَ. This didn't, surprise him. He was not happy. Some people said, we use something like a horn. He didn't. Something like trumpet. He didn't like it. Bell. He didn't like it. And he said, these are what others do. فانصرف عبد الله بن زيد وهو مهتم لهم رسول الله. Abdullah ibn Zayd, who was concerned about the concern of Rasulullah, he was sad. He left that gathering and he was sad that Rasulullah is concerned and there is no satisfactory solution. فَأُرِيَ الْأَذَانِ فِي مَنَامِهِ. Then in dream he was able to see azan. Next day he went to the Prophet. فَغَدَى عَلَى رَسُولِ اللَّهِ فَأَخْبَرَهُ. Next day he went to the Prophet and said, Ya Rasulullah, إِنِّي لَبَيْنَ النَّائِمٍ وَيَقْظَانٍ إِذْ أَتَانِي آتٍ فَأَرَانِيَ الْأَذَانِ. I was between, sleeping and dreaming and awake. Then someone came and showed me how to do adhan. وكان عمر بن الخطاب قد رآه قبل ذلك فكتمه 20 يوما. And says that Umar ibn Khattab had this dream 20 days before, but he didn't mention it. ثم أخبر النبي. He also said that I had this dream 20 days ago. So Rasulullah said, ما منعك أن تخبرني? Why you didn't inform me? He said, سبقني عبد الله بن زيد فأستحييت. He said, Abdullah ibn Zayd preceded me and I felt shy. But Abdullah ibn Zayd just had it last night. Yeah, if he had 20 days before, so when Rasulullah was discussing with them. So, in any case, فقال رسول الله يا بلال قم فانظر ما يأمرك به عبد الله ibn Zayd فافعله. This is in Sunan Abu Dawood. Bilal, stand up, see what he teaches you to do, and you would do it. فأذن بلال. And then a person says, called Abu Bishr, he says that Ansar have this idea, because this Abdullah ibn Zayd was one of the Ansar, that if Abdullah ibn Zayd himself was not ill, Rasulullah would have made him mu'adhin instead of Bilal, because he had this dream. In another hadith, it says that Haddasani Abi Abdullah ibn Zayd, the son of Abdullah ibn Zayd, says that my father told me that لما أمر رسول الله بالناقوس يعمل ليضرب به للناس لجمع الصلاة طاف بي وأنا نائم رجل يحمل ناقوسا في يده. He says, according to this hadith, when Rasulullah said to use bell, like church, naqus, he said, when I was sleeping, someone who was carrying a bell in his hand in my dream came to me and said, Ya Abdullah, أتبيع الناقوس وما تصنع به. He said, do you sell bell? What do you do with bell? I said, ندعو به إلى الصلاة. We use it to call for salat. Then in my dream, that person told me, أفلا أدلك على ما هو خير من ذلك. Shouldn't I tell you what is better for you than this? I said, yes. He said, then you say, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. And then he says, also you do for iqamah, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. He says, Falamma asbahtu, when I woke up in next day, I went to the Prophet and said that I had this dream. Rasulullah said, إِنَّهَا لَرُؤْيَا حَقٍّ إِنشَاءَ Inshallah, this is a true dream. فَقُمْ مَعَ بِلَالٍ فَأَلْغِ عَلَيْهِ مَا رَأَيْتَ. So you and Bilal go and teach him what you had in dream. فَإِنَّهُ أَنْدَى صَوْتًا مِنْكَ. His voice is, like better than you, or I don't know, softer than you, something like this. Then he says, I went with Bilal and I taught him. فَسَمِعَ ذَلِكَ عُمَرُ بْنُ الْخَطَّابِ وَهُوَ فِي بَيْتِهِ. Umar ibn Khattab heard this story and فَخَرَجَ يَجُرُّ رِدَاءَهُ. He came from his home while he was touching with his cloak on the ground. It means when you are very much rushing or angry, sometimes, your cloak, you don't fix it properly, it's touching the floor. He said, وَالَّذِي بَعَثَكَ بِالْحَقِّ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ لَقَدْ رَأَيْتُ مِثْلَ مَا رَأَى. He said, by the one who has raised you as a prophet, I had the same dream. And Rasulullah said, فَلِلَّهِ الْحَمْدِ. Alhamdulillah that you had also this dream. Then Ayatullah Subhani has a very good discussion here about the content of these hadiths and sanad, the chains of these hadiths. One by one, he studies them. About the content, he says, this would not fit into our understanding of prophethood. لا تتفق مع مقام النبوة. We don't expect Rasulullah, for example, to tell us how to cook food or how to make your houses, for example. But we expect him to tell us how to make salat. Yeah. If religion has salat as a pillar, then how can Rasulullah not know and wonder what to do? How can for many days he be, even 20 days, for example, according to some versions, he'll be wondering what to do? Allah says in the Quran, عَلَّمَكَ مَا لَمْ تَكُنْ تَعْلَمْ وَكَانَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكَ عَظِيمًا. Allah taught you what you didn't know, or what you didn't have any way to know, and His favor upon you means His teaching was great. So this doesn't match with the position of prophethood. Also, there are conflicts between these hadiths. For example, one hadith suggests that the second Khalifa had this dream 20 days before Abdullah. But in another hadith, it says in the same night. So in one hadith says 20 days before, in another says the same night. Another thing is that in some versions they say because of Abdullah ibn Zayd, they started, because of the dream of Abdullah ibn Zayd, they legislated adhan. And when the second Khalifa heard this, he went to the Prophet and mentioned this. And he said, I felt embarrassed to say. But in some other versions, it says, no, the legislation was because of the second Caliph. We have hadith which says the second Caliph started this. He suggested to the Prophet. There is no mention of a dream of Abdullah ibn Zayd. For example, in Tirmidhi, it says when Muslims arrived in Medina, some of them said, let's, for example, choose a horn to call. فَقَالَ عُمَرُ بْنُ الْخَطَّابِ أَوَلَا تَبْعَثُونَ رَجُلًا يُنَادِي بِالصَّلَاةِ. When Muslims were discussing, the second Khalifa said, why you don't ask a person to call for salah? There is no mention of dream, there is no mention of Abdullah ibn Zayd or any dream. They said just in the discussion, the meeting, he suggested this. فَقَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ يَا بِلَالْ قُمْ فَنَادِ بِالصَّلَاةِ. So you see, they conflict with each other. Nasa'i also puts the same story. In some hadiths, they say Rasulullah himself initiated. For example, in Bayhaqi, it says that ذكروا أن يضربوا ناقوسا أو ينوروا نارا. Some people said we should ring the bell. Some people said we should ignite fire. But Amara Bilal, but Rasulullah said to Bilal to say azan and iqamah. So here, Rasulullah himself told them what to do. In Bukhari also quotes this. So with such contradiction and conflict, how can we rely on these hadiths? In some of them says that second Khalifa was present. In another says he was in his house and he heard and came and he was yajurru rida'ahu. Then how many people had dream? According to Halabi, those who had dream were not just Abdullah ibn Zayd and the second Khalifa. It is said that Abu Bakr also had the same dream. Some people say 7 people from Ansar had this dream. Some people said 14 people had this dream. So what kind of, basis can be for, this kind of conflict? And it is interesting that all these people had dream and Rasulullah himself, Na'uzubillah, didn't know what to do. According to Bukhari, Rasulullah himself asked Bilal when he was consulting what to do. There was mashwara. He said to Bilal to call for salat, and the second Khalifa was present. Abdullah ibn Umar, he says, when Muslims came to Medina, they were getting together for salat, and they were wondering what time is salat, and there was no call for salat. One day they were talking about different options, and فقال عمر أولا تبعثون رجلا ينادي بالصلاة فقال رسول الله يا بلال قم فناد بالصلاة. So in Sahih Bukhari there is no mention here about dream. It says Rasulullah said do this. Then he goes to the discussion about sanad. All these hadiths, one by one, Ayatullah Subhani studies the narrators that have occurred in the chains. For example, the first hadith which we mentioned from Sunan Abu Dawood, he says it's za'if. Why? Because first of all, names of all narrators are not mentioned. He says, Umumatan lahu min al-ansar, from some of his uncles. Who are these uncles? Yeah? So hadith, you know that when one person is unknown, the whole sanad becomes weak. In order to verify the chain, all must be known and verifiable. The second hadith also has problem. He mentions the problems. So basically, you would see these conflicting hadiths that are there, their content conflict, the chains are not reliable, but in the school of Ahlul Bayt, we have authentic hadith, and also we have similar to them in non-Shia, in some Sunni sources, that would suggest something which also makes sense, that this was taught by Jibreel to the Prophet, and Prophet taught Bilal and other Muslims how to make azan and iqamah for prayer. There is another discussion in this short book of Ayatullah Subhani about sections of azan and iqamah, as I said, which inshallah maybe another time we can study. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
one question that's come through online, and then maybe we can close. So the question is not regarding adhan, but it is about some differences of opinion perhaps. It says that, are there Shia hadith that explain which ayats of the Holy Quran have mustahab sajda associated with them? Or are the signs in Mus'haf Usman Taha Sunni-based opinions or derived from Sunni hadith? As regard to the wajib sajda, we have clear fatwa from Ayatullah Subhani. So this is just regarding the mustahab sajda.
Yeah. For mustahab, we have sources, and for mustahab also, it's easier because we have a rule, قاعدة التسامح في أدلة السنن. So if you hear, there are many hadiths that Rasulullah said, من بلغه عني شيء من الثواب فعمل به رجاء ذلك الثواب أوتي ذلك الثواب وإن لم أقل به. So if someone receives a hadith that Rasulullah recommended this and does it with the niyyah of raja, with the hope, then inshallah will be, if it makes sense, of course, it should be something that makes sense and it's compatible with our sources, then you can do it. Therefore, our ulama for mustahabbat, they may be more open-handed than wajib and haram. Of course, they may not give fatwa as mustahab, but they may say, you can do this. So for saying mustahab, we don't need to have necessarily authentic hadith from Shia sources. Of course, authentic hadith can be even from Sunni sources. If we can verify narrators of Sunni sources, we accept them. So the hands of faqih here are more open. But we can see which ayah they mean, and because based on the case, to see what reason we have. Do we have hadith from our side, or is it general hadith in the books? Sometimes there are hadith in the books of tafsir, which are more like historical. Yes.
So, Sheikh, you were mentioning these Shia hadiths which happen in Miraj, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
We hear a lot of hadiths coming from Miraj, a lot of we hear. For example, one of them you mentioned was there was a time of Salah, but if you then look at Miraj, is it outside the concept of time? And then how do we bring in these that the Prophet recited Salat in Miraj, and how does it relate to this world? And when it's outside the concept of time, if you were to think, or someone asked that question.
Mi'raj has different stages. At some stage, the Prophet went with his body. Yeah, we believe in Mi'raj Jismani. So not just his spirit. It was with body and a spirit. But maybe after some levels, then it's just the spirit. But up to certain degree is with the body. So these skies or heavens that we have, 7, some of them may be things that Rasulullah went with his body. Okay? Some of them maybe then become more spiritual, more abstract. Even those which are abstract then can be mithali and then aqli, like it's not all of a sudden.
So there would have been the concept of time there if you prayed.
Yeah, so when it is in alam physical world or alam mithal, even in alam mithal and barzakh we have time. Because the Quran says, النار يعرضون عليها غدوا وعشيا ويوم يقوم الحساب. They will be presented to fire in mornings and evenings and the day of judgment. So this morning and evening is barzakh. So in Barzakh we have day and night. You're welcome.
Sheikh, assalamu alaikum.
Salam alaikum.
I have two questions, if I may.
Yes.
The first one might be very long answer, so feel free to deflect it. But the first one is, could you give us some insight into why there is certain differences between adhan and iqama, and really why some of the phrases are repeated in some, and then like 4 times, twice, and then some in the other only once. The second question is more philosophical, in that adhan and iqama is recommended even when you are by yourself. So how much of adhan and iqama is for calling to people versus calling the self? Or is it 50-50? Like, what's the philosophy there?
Adhan is more for announcing that Salat time has arrived and you should get ready. Iqama is to prepare for entering into Salat. So it's the beginning of Iqamatus Salat. This is why we call it Iqama. Adhan is taking longer, and as we have in many of these hadiths, comes in pairs of 2. It's shafa'a, but iqama can be 1. But why, when you are alone, you make adhan? There are different reasons. First of all, my understanding is that Salat is supposed to be jama'ah, and furada is permitted. But Salat is established to be done in jama'ah. And this is why in Salat we say things in plural form. Yeah? إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ up to As-salamu alayna wa ala ibadillah. So Salat has to be jama'ah, but Allah forgives us if we do it furada. Yes. This is one point. The second point is that when it's the time of Salat, it's important that you make adhan, even if you are making furada, but there are people who hear. Your family or other people, they hear the voice of a person, a mu'min is calling for Salat. So this takbir, la ilaha illallah, spreads in the air. And also it would send away shaitan. So many ulama say, try in your home, say adhan loudly. Not to the extent that you annoy neighbors, but say adhan loudly, because shayateen will go away from your home. And this is very spiritual. Many of our ulama, they were very keen to say adhan. Although someone else could say azan, but they were very keen to say azan, because azan by itself is a great thing. So even if you are alone, you can say adhan, and it would bless the place. If there are other people who hear, it's extra bonus. But even if you are alone, it would bless this place, would send Satan's away. You're welcome. Jazakumullah khair. Ahsan.
So I think at this point, Sheikh, now we just, on behalf of all of us here, the team, but everybody, we'd like to thank you very much.
My pleasure, thank you.
You mentioned at the beginning that this was a course that started, or a journey that started in 2016.
Yes, alhamdulillah.
We had 15 semesters, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
And thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for your istiqamah.
Shall we pray for your increased tawfiq
Inshallah.
and your quick return back to Stanmore?
Inshallah.
Allahumma
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا وامن علينا برضاه وهب لنا رأفته ورحمته ودعاءه خيره. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send his salutations to the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, and to send his light and rahmah to all our great scholars and maraja who have taught us beautiful teachings of Ahlul Bayt. May Allah inshallah increase their likes, and may Allah preserve for us our living ulama and maraja, and may Allah give us tawfiq till end of our life to be always engaged in learning and sharing and practicing, inshallah. May Allah give shafa to all people who are ill, especially people that we have concern for them, we have been asked to pray for them. And may Allah inshallah send rahmah to all mu'mineen and mu'minat of this community and of your families, inshallah. Bihaqq Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. التماس